Hello and welcome to our session on open publishing. This is open access to the journal literature. Now, my name is Merle Massey. I am the coordinator of undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you so much for joining us today. And with us, we have a special guest. This is Dee Dee Dawson, and she is the Associate Librarian, Science and Scholarly Communication here at the University of Saskatchewan. Dee Dee, thank you so much for being with us today.
Problem. Thank you for inviting me.
And I'll pass it directly over to you. Take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Right, so I'm a librarian here at USask, and I sort of specialize in scholarly communication as well as the sciences. And I'm actually a member of the faculty too, so that means I'm also a researcher, and open publishing and scholarly communication is my research interest as well. And I have made a commitment to publishing all of my works open access. So I have experience as well as research interest in this topic, and I'm an advocate too. So you'll see me get quite excited and about this topic because I think it's very important, and I hope you'll agree with me by the end. So I have created these slides in Google Slides, and so at the end I'll share the link with you because there's quite a lot of links to various resources and literature that you might want to follow up on after. So the slides will be openly available afterwards for, I don't intend on ever taking them down really, so for perpetuating. So please follow up on all the links. Don't feel like you need to do that right away as we're talking though. And feel free to ask questions in the chat or verbally at any point, and I'll try and check the chat regularly. And the other thing is on these slides, there's a notes field that you won't be able to see, but that will also have additional information. So when you go to look at the slides afterwards, you can see some supplementary information and sort of resources there. So that's all of my sort of preamble, but let's get started. I talk about this topic quite a lot throughout the year to different groups. So I've adjusted the content for sort of an undergraduate research level. So I don't have really specific advice about publishing for yourselves, but you can certainly join some of my sessions throughout the year, watch for them through the student learning services at the library. And I typically hold these sessions for graduate students about really practical tips on how to publish your research openly. But I do have some specific ones for yourselves as well. Trying to advance the slides. Oh, my mouse is on the wrong page. Maybe that's why. Ah, here we go. So before we get right into the open access part, I think it's useful to talk a bit about the history of journals specifically, or more generally, I guess, because that sort of gives you some of the context and background for the topic and why open access developed and why it's important. Talking about the dysfunction in the conventional journal market and the information privilege that this sort of evolves from or has evolved into. It sort of gives you more context about why open access has developed. Okay, and then we'll get into open access specifically and some of that practical stuff too. So if you are interested in starting to make your research or your work, your output, any kind of output of research can be made openly available. I'll give you some tips for how to do that. So let's start off talking about the scientific journal. So here's a bit of history. I know Meryl is the historian here. I'm not me, so I'm not going to get too into the weeds here, but just to give you like an overview of how journals developed. And I say scientific journal because journals kind of started in the sciences, but now they've sort of diversified into all other disciplines, of course. And you see the picture here of the most current issue of Science, probably one of the most prestigious, well-known, multidisciplinary scientific journals out there. Nature is probably its current rival. And so I'll be really brief on this part because I know you've all had some other sort of instruction sessions about searching for literature and, managing all the literature that you're finding, like in Zotero or those sorts of things. And so you have sort of a basic idea of what journals are, I think, maybe at this stage, but I don't like to take that for granted because you know, as an undergrad, all throughout my undergrad, I had no idea really what journals were. It wasn't something that anybody ever really discussed or instructed us on. They just all kind of assumed that everybody knows what journals are. Let's not spend any time, or somebody else has taught students what journals are. And so there was never really any discussion or instruction about journals. So anyway, journals are serial publications. This is sort of a library terminology, serials or periodicals, meaning they come out regularly on a regular basis, like magazines, monthly, bi-monthly, weekly, depends on the title. They're primary sources, so meaning that they're the results of original research. And the term primary sources is used differently in different disciplines. So humanities researchers will use that term differently. It'll be like a document from the time period or from a particular historical figure under study or that kind of thing. But in the sciences, especially, primary sources are journal articles or patents, that kind of thing. The first time an original piece of research is communicated in something that's preserved. So obviously scientists informally communicate amongst themselves and also at conferences. But then once it's down on paper or electronically nowadays, that is a primary source. And I say mostly because journals can also contain other things like editorials, that kind of thing, which aren't necessarily primary sources, or, you know, review articles. Well, we're getting into more detail here, but not technically a primary source, but mostly what's in the art and the journals are primary sources, and they can be highly technical because remember, these are researchers communicating with each other. So they're using the jargon or the technical language that they are familiar with. So this is not to deter you. Anybody's welcome to read these articles if they can access them, which we'll talk about later. But just be aware that these are intended to be for a particular audience that's already very knowledgeable in the topic. Peer-reviewed, and again, mostly because some of those things like editorials are not. So this is a kind of a quality control process where others in the field who are also experts sort of review the manuscript before it's published. So not all submissions are accepted into the journal. There are so many titles. There are tens to hundreds of thousands of journals out there. Some are very multidisciplinary, like the science title that we just saw. Some are very narrow in scope. Okay, and I don't think there is an accurate number because they're constantly splitting and merging, and new ones are being created, and other ones just sort of fade away, and there's no real good way to keep track. An interesting part of this system is that authors and peer reviewers are not paid for their work. So this is the main content of the journal, right? The actual article itself and the quality control. Neither of these are paid for by the publisher. And so we'll talk more about that in a bit because that's an important part of this. And there are various business models that support these publishers too. And so as you can imagine, these things are not things that you'll find at your local 7-Eleven beside the People magazine. These are very specific audiences, small audiences often. So they're really only subscribed to by academic libraries, and maybe individual researchers might have their own personal subscription to one or two of them. Okay, so that's a really basic, brief review of what journals are, just so we're all on the same page. And now a bit of the history. So if you can see this, can anybody guess, if you can put in the chat, what you think this image is? I'll wait a second or so. Yeah, look over here because I have another screen going. That's where I have the chat. Philosophy journal. That's what I would have guessed because it says Philosophical Transactions, first journal article. Okay. Okay, so you're both kind of right. It is the cover of the very first journal. Okay, it's a bit hard to read, so I kind of copied out Philosophical Transactions and some of the interesting different language they had at that time, because this was from 1665, right? The very first edition of Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. This is generally considered the first scientific journal. There's another one, I think, in France at around the same time too. The Royal Society, meaning the Royal Society of London, which was a scholarly society, an early scholarly society, which means, a group of individuals would often meet and discuss their interest in the natural world, let's say. And so I think it's interesting that they call it philosophical transactions, because I would have guessed the same as Merle that, oh, this must be a philosophy journal. But really at that time, they didn't really call themselves scientists, from my understanding. I think they called themselves natural philosophers, right? And this was before there were many different subdisciplines of the sciences. And so they were all kind of people that were interested in the natural world and observing it. And this was right around the time of the scientific revolution, and the scientific method was developing. So up until this point, if you were interested in these topics, you would write full-length book type works, I guess. And so when the scientific method developed, there was basically people were observing nature, making observations, so really discrete sort of factual things, and doing experiments, starting experiments. So really short sort of things that they wanted to write up, and not really full-length book topics, right? So the printing press had been developed for a while, so that technology was available, but they needed another sort of outlet to communicate with each other, short, discrete sort of topics. So philosophical transactions became of the first journal, because up until then, the scientists or the people, the scholarly society participants, let's say, communicated amongst themselves by writing letters, basically. And this became very inefficient, cumbersome. And so this journal was developed. Anyway, I think that's quite interesting, and it sort of leads us, I like talking about the history because it sort of gives us some context for thinking about how publishing is today and why we have these strange quirks about the authors aren't getting paid, that kind of thing. Philosophical Transactions is still publishing today, so it's the oldest journal and also the longest running, and it's split into two sections. So you see the two current issues, a physical and a life sciences issues. This society also has some other journals as well. So really the establishment of journals by societies, not just the Royal Society, it was often by early scholarly societies, helped all of these early scientists with several different problems they had. So I talked a little bit about the dissemination problem. So they were writing these cumbersome handwritten letters to each other, and they were all kind of floating around. So they didn't have that common sort of communication method from one to many, right? And so the journal would solve that. And in doing so, it created this ongoing knowledge base. So they weren't repeating experiments that their colleagues already had done. They could look back and say, this one's been done, let's build upon it, right? So it's creating more efficiency in the system, creating a common knowledge base for everybody. The peer review, the validation, the certification aspect came quite a bit later. So not all these things developed kind of at the same time. Peer review is still kind of in development, let's say. It's not a perfect process by any means, but it's the best we've got. But it did sort of come on with these journals later on. The registration and rewards is interesting. So from my understanding, a lot of the early scientists, they were very cautious about talking about what they found out because they were afraid of getting scooped, essentially. So the idea of putting it on paper and publishing it like in this journal established them as, the first person who came up with this idea, basically established priority. And so that was another interesting development for journals. And I'm not sure that that's exactly what they're created for, but it was another bonus, basically. And another bonus that came in time also was this idea of rewards. And this plays out in the current system to ill effect in a lot of cases. So we'll talk about that. So basically, you can build your career as a scientist through publishing in journals. And this will, nowadays, this is necessary for tenure and for us getting grants to do more research, basically. So there's a great article. I've put a little link. Well, it's not a link because it's an older article, but anyway, the reference is down there, so you can follow that if you like. So a bit more on the history. So leading up to like the Second World War, I guess, all of these hundreds of years that we've had journals, it was mainly the scholarly societies that run them. And they ran them kind of off the side of their desks almost. This wasn't a money-making, profit-driven thing. This was a service to their community mainly. And really before the Second World War-ish, all up until then, there wasn't a lot of pure scientists, because this wasn't a career that you could, make a lot of money in. There wasn't a lot of grants going into it, that kind of thing like there are today. So it was a small operation generally. This all changed after the Second World War, and government started to really invest heavily in research, and therefore universities expanded. More people were getting into the sciences and other disciplines as well, and producing research that needed to be published. And these societies, of course, they were getting overwhelmed by all of these submissions, and they started selling off their journals to commercial publishers, and the commercial publishers established their own journals because they started to see that there's quite a lucrative market in this. And so really the last 25 years of the 20th century, and this has continued on in the last 20 years of this century too, really has really been about the complete expansion of all these journals. There's more and more journals every day, but also consolidation. So there's lots more journals, but there's fewer and fewer publishers, if that makes sense. So the bigger publishers are buying up and consolidating all these smaller ones and creating what we call an oligopoly, which I'll talk a bit more of in a bit. So here's a nice image. This is from 1961. So this was talked about quite a while ago, how the journals are really expanding in number. So you can see my little cursor there. Way down here is Philosophical Transactions, 1665 or so. You can see it was kind of a bit of a slow growth in the early centuries, and then a really rapid expansion up into the 20th century. Next page here is the oligopoly article that I mentioned. So this is the consolidation of journals. So we've been seeing this happen for the last, I don't know, 40 years or so. And these researchers, these are Canadian researchers, went and studied it and confirmed that yes, there are 5 major commercial publishers that are now dominating more than half of the market of journals. So we call this the oligopoly, a very important paper published in 2015. So that's a bit of the background. That's a bit of the history. Maybe I'll pause for a second in case there's any questions I don't see in the chat. Okay. So I'll go on and talk a little bit. I've referred sort of obliquely to some of the dysfunction in this market. And so let's get into this a bit more detail, and then you'll see like the reasoning for the calls for change and the move to a different system of open access. Okay, so we have 3 companies here. I'm sure you all recognize at least 2 of them. So we have Apple, of course, major technology company. You probably all have something of theirs, maybe. Google, of course, very powerful. You've probably used it today, dominant and almost a monopoly in the internet searching market. Does everybody know about what Elsevier is? Anybody want to guess in the chat what Elsevier is? I've probably been leading publisher. Yes, you're right. Elsevier is a publisher. Elsevier is probably the largest commercial scholarly publisher there is. Lots of books, journals, lots of universities send them a lot of money every year. So which of these 3 companies had the highest profit margin in 2018? That was the last time I looked it all up. Which would you guess? Anybody in the chat want to guess? on because I think this is probably obvious. You probably guessed where I'm going here. Most people on the street would probably say Google or Apple have the highest profit margin of the three because they've never heard of Elsevier, right? But in fact, Elsevier at that time, and probably now, if I looked now too, these things fluctuate, but generally scholarly publishers are pretty standard, have a very high profit margin, right? And so profit margin being what is left of the profit after all of the expenses, deficits, whatever, have been taken away, and what the company is left with is presented as a percentage. In the notes field on this slide, you'll find all the links to the different data points and explanations. So if you're interested, you can follow up. So this is surprising, I would think. Yes, I've seen that article, Meryl. Thanks for posting that in the chat. I have that, I think, in my further readings, in my slides too, at the end. It's kind of interesting. Why would this company, a commercial publishing company, have so much more profit than these other two that are more widely known and obviously profitable, like Google? So I went and I looked at, so Relax. This is the sort of the parent company of Elsevier. Okay, so Elsevier is one business under the portfolio of Relax. So when you're looking up sort of market information online, you can look for Elsevier under this name. And this is from their current annual report from last year. And you can see year over year, it's pretty steady. Last year, there's a tiny dip, maybe. Pretty steady operating profit margin of around 30%, let's say. SPARC is an advocacy group, a scholarly publishing academic resources coalition. It advocates for open access and academic libraries, that kind of thing. And they produce analysis reports on this type of thing as well. This is the report from 2019. Elsevier is definitely the most profitable area for Relax. It's the most profitable business in their portfolio. And so when we talk about the 30% margin, that's actually for Relax overall. But if we separate out Elsevier itself, it's more in the 37% operating profit margin range. Okay, so it's just to give you an idea of, like, this is a highly profitable business. So here's a slide that the University Library created back in 2019 when we were pushed basically by lack of budget over many years because of all the increases in the costs of these things, to have to cancel some journals. Okay, you may, if you've been around for a few years, you may remember this from the end of 2019. And so we went around and did lots of talking to different groups on campus about why we needed to cancel some journals because of these issues. So this shows those 5 major scientific or scholarly publishing oligopoly companies, basically, Elsevier being one of them. We tend to pick on Elsevier because it's the largest and it seems to be the most profitable, and it's very sort of aggressive in a lot of its licensing and pricing practices. But, Sage, Springer Nature, Taylor Francis, Wiley, they are the others that are very much in the same category. They produce half of the journal literature out there. And what they do is they kind of bundle together all of these journal titles. So we often don't purchase or subscribe to different titles individually. Nowadays, we purchase these big deals, so hundreds or even thousands of journals all sold in a big bundle. And you can see sort of in this table some of the other companies here, like we talked about Google and Apple already. Pfizer, of course, in the news a lot lately. They're highly profitable as well. Facebook is a huge outlier, of course. So when you see these sorts of profit margins, there's something going on in the market, right? So Facebook is a clear outlier. There's something going on there. It's dominant in the social media market. Google and Apple, Pfizer, these are all sort of dominant for particular reasons in the market. But why scholarly publishing too? The other thing I mentioned here, okay, and the third point is the annual increases. So we'll talk about that in a minute too, well over inflation. So another chart to give you some context, journal publishers versus other companies. And this is an older chart from what, 2007, or sorry, 2007. And let's see. So it's an older chart, but the reason I put it up here is just to show you, like, this is sort of a long trending issue. This isn't something that's just developed in the last few years. This is something that's been going on for quite a while. So you can see all of the red bars are scholarly publishers, and the others are sort of companies from different sectors. So Microsoft, you can see up there, right up there with Springer and Elsevier. Probably Microsoft has gone down a little bit, and I would say maybe Google and Facebook are way up there now, of course. Disney, Apple, Exxon Mobil, like some of the resource companies, McDonald's. You'll see like Walmart over here at 5.8%. So Walmart, I would say, an economics major, but I would say most economists would say Walmart is a very highly successful company in their business category, right? And they're generally between 5 or 10% profit margin range, and they're considered highly profitable. So when you start seeing some of these other companies that are up in the 30% range, there's something dysfunctional in the market that's causing that, right? Okay. So I mentioned a little bit about the journal pricing. This has been a long-standing problem. It even has a term that librarians use called the serials crisis. And so this has been developing for many years. And you see the library journal is one of our technical kind of trade journals in the librarian profession. They do this periodical price survey every year. This was the headline from last year, costs outstrip library budgets. It's actually not news because this has been happening a long time. And this is why we had to cancel the journals, because over the years, libraries have had to cut various things in order to accommodate the constant increase in pricing of these journals. And so book budgets have gone down. We've sort of canceled lots of other kinds of resources that maybe overlapped or weren't as heavily used, just so we could keep access to the journals. And now we're reaching the breaking point. We have to reach a breaking point at some point. And so a lot of libraries are reaching that point now because it's been so long that we've been doing this, trying to maintain. And so you can see on the table there, the average price per title for certain disciplines. Chemistry has the notorious label of always being the highest. This is perpetually the case, and definitely lots of the other sciences as well. So the average price is around $6,000 per title per year. But remember, we generally purchase these as big bundles anyway, so that's kind of just an indicator. And then there's some extreme examples, of course, to pick on chemistry again. This is more chemical engineering, really. You can see the price there. This is online subscription for one journal for 1 year for one institution, okay? And this is a Wiley title, so one of the big 5 publishers, and it's just an extraordinary amount of money. Anyway, this is what the university library pays per year. I'm just looking at the chat, sorry. So we don't actually.
And you did answer that. No,
Okay.
it's Merle. I'm curious, how do these compare to some of the social science and humanities journals? Are they typically cheaper, or are they in this price range as well?
The social science and humanities journals are much cheaper, much more affordable for sure. Maybe hundreds of dollars a year to maybe 1,000 or 2,000, depending on the title. So it's really a major issue with the sciences and health sciences for sure. Yeah, good question.
Thanks.
And I'll get into some specifics about what the university library pays in just a minute too, so you can have some really specific data. And I wanted to give credit to Wiley for actually posting these amounts, because this is quite shocking, and I'm surprised that they still publicly post this, because most publishers don't. You have to actually make an inquiry and say, this is the size of my institution, give me a quote, because it's kind of bad publicity for them to post these things publicly, because people like me are pointing them out, right? So anyway, this is an extreme example. And these prices, if you think they're high, they're increasing higher than inflation every year, right? So this is a screenshot from a nice little video, if you'd like to follow that link later, talks about open access. And this particular chart is based on Association of Research Libraries data from over 30 years. So we're looking at the rise of inflation, the two guys standing on the line down below, 68% over 30 years. That's sort of the general rate of inflation over 30 years. Whereas if we take, like, separate out the journals, journal publishers, price increases, it's 260% over the same time period. So the increases are well beyond inflation. Library budgets are not increasing at the same rate, let me tell you. There is a breaking point that libraries reach at some point, and a lot of them are reaching it now, like we did a couple years ago, and we had to cancel Wiley and Taylor and Francis packages. Okay, so here's what I mentioned. I wanted to show you some actual prices. So university libraries have started being a bit more activist, I guess you could say, in being transparent and sort of posting, this is what we're actually paying every year. So this is for the 2019-2020 data. This is our library, University of Saskatchewan. We've posted it on the Canadian Association of Research Libraries website, I guess, along with other university libraries across the country. I've circled in red there the Science Direct Freedom Collection. So to continue picking on Elsevier, this is their big deal bundle. They call it Science Direct, and ironically, the Freedom Collection. We paid in 2019-2020 $1.6 million for 1 year of access to their journals for one institution. Okay. Let me go on to the next slide. So this kind of gives a compilation of all of the CARL members. So these are research libraries across Canada. Let's see, 28 subscribed to the Science Direct Freedom Collection. So in all, for that year, $40 million went out from Canada to Elsevier for access to 1 year of the Freedom Collection. This is around 1,500, 2,000 journals. So it's a lot of journals. One thing about big bundles, though, or big deals like this, is that publishers seem to sort of add lots of titles in. You don't necessarily want, or you wouldn't necessarily individually subscribe to those titles yourself. You would subscribe to a certain aspect or a certain sort of small allotment of those titles, but then they pile in all their others to make it seem like it's this great deal. And maybe it was in the beginning, but in these later years, it's not so great a deal anymore, and more and more libraries are breaking up these bundles and just subscribing to individual titles. Okay, so that gives you kind of an idea of the pricing. So I've been harping on all this pricing and all these extreme profits, and so what's the problem, right? I'm sure, you know, some people might say we're a capitalist society. I mean, it's great. They're doing well. They've found a business model that works. They're making lots of money for their shareholders. What's the problem here? So let's go through the problem. So basically, we're at this university. How is the university funded? Like, what makes it run? Basically, taxpayer money, right? So we get a big allotment from the provincial government every year. We also get money from you, from the students, from your tuition dollars. And we also get money from grants. So these are often federally funded. So we have provincial funding, federal funding, and what's federal funding? It's also taxpayers, right? So you, again, are funding the university on sort of two levels of your taxes. So the grants go to researchers to fund their research, and that comes into the operating of the university. It also, all of this funds the salaries of faculty to do their research and then report on the results. And they write these articles for those journals, okay? It's part of their work. This is sort of the tradition. They give away their articles for free to these publishers because we looked at the history, right? This is just historical service to the discipline, to their society. It's long-standing tradition in academia. Faculty give away those articles. They're not paid individually for them from the publishers. That just wasn't the tradition in the scholarly society days, and it's continued on into the commercial publisher days now. The faculty have their salaries, they have their research grants, they don't necessarily need money back for each of those articles, although they might want it. But also, the other thing that's not talked about so often is that they also sign away their copyright, so their legal, I don't know, access to these works, all the legal rights to the work for free to those publishers. The publishers do not need all of that copyright, but they make it seem like they do. So they sign away all their access to that work, and the publishers have complete control over that work, basically. In the small font there, you can see we've already talked about the other researchers also peer review for free, because that was also part of the original system where it was a service to their scholarly society. So basically, this is why the profit margins are so high. You know, they don't have to pay for their content. They don't have to pay for their quality control. Certainly there are costs in the system. I'm not suggesting there aren't. To publish, you need to have some input into the system, some money, right? But generally they're making much more. Okay, I'm just seeing that there's something in the chat. Is that a requirement for publishing with a conventional publisher then signing over copyright? It's not a requirement. They make it seem like it is. They'll tell you it is, maybe. It's not a requirement. You can negotiate. So we'll talk about that a bit more. What does the publisher lose by giving up copyright? It means that you give up your control about what you could do with that work after. So maybe you want to translate that work into another language. You can't do that. Maybe you want to give away copies to your students. Well, nowadays we have a clause in our copyright law that you can do that, but in the past you couldn't. You know, there's all sorts of different things we could get into there with copyright. But I mean, if you keep your copyright, you can do all of those things. And the publisher can still publish that article. They don't need all of those rights. There's a whole bunch of different rights involved in copyright, and you can negotiate which ones are important to you that you want to keep. Okay, we'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit later. Okay, and then, so what happens is the publishers then have all of this content, they have the quality control provided for them, they create these journals, and they sell them back to us, right? So in effect, you, the taxpayer, the student with your tuition, you've paid for this research twice. You've paid for it to be produced, you've paid for us to buy it back from the publisher. So it's a really strange system. When we talk to the regular people on the street about this system, people are generally like, that's really dumb. Smart people at universities are doing something really dumb here. But it really is just kind of a quirk of the history, that the way it's developed, and a lot of other things. So let's sort of summarize all of these things. So the publishers do not pay for the content or quality control. So this is why they're able to make so much profit, right? So other companies would always have to pay for these things, and that's why they're not able to make such high profit margins, of course. Okay. So dysfunctional market, what's going on here? So every one of these journal articles is a mini monopoly, meaning that it's a unique item. This is the result of original research. You can't say, okay, I need to have the results, but this article is too expensive for me to buy, so I'm going to go buy this no-name article instead, because it's not the same, right? I'm sure you can see that. You need access to that particular article that gives the results that you're interested in. Libraries have been, I don't know, these kind of middlemen for a long time. You know, we've kind of, I feel like we've kind of gotten in the way and sort of well-meaningly sort of taken this problem off of our faculty and students. Like, we'll handle this, you guys, just worry about your research and study, and we'll manage all of this on your behalf. But the result of that is that the end consumers of the product, the people that are actually reading this research, have no idea about the costs in the system. They don't directly pay, and that means that the market is dysfunctional. That means that there's no direct pressure on the publisher for the prices, right? So the publisher then will charge what the market will bear. So there's no market pressure. That kind of makes sense. The incentive system I've alluded to a little bit. Remember when we talked about the rewards and reputation of this is some of the things that the journals originally created for these early scientists. So it's prestigious for scientists to publish in certain journals that have high impact factors. It's a whole other topic we could get into. And so that kind of perpetuates the system. These journals are generally controlled by those commercial publishers who are making a lot of money off of them. And people, faculty, researchers need to publish in them to make renewal, tenure, promotion, to get hired even, or to have merit decisions like salary increases each year, that kind of thing. So the incentive system for career progression in academia is closely tied to the journals and the prestige of certain titles. And so that is why we have to buy or purchase access to these titles, because it's so tied to career progression. And even though academia tends to veer politically liberal, it's very conservative in its traditions, let's say. It's hard to change long-standing traditions in academia. And the other thing is academia is kind of averse to collective action. So we have a lot of trouble getting all of the universities together to, work together on this kind of problem, because you've probably heard that analogy, like it's like herding cats, Academics are very strong-minded, they have their own opinions, and it's hard to kind of get everybody together to work on this problem, because collective action would help change this system, and it's just difficult to get there. Okay. So what do you think about the broader societal impacts of this model? So I hope you've been thinking about this all along. I'm not going to pause too long because I'm watching the time. But basically, I'm thinking you've probably come to this assumption. The system is inequitable. It's unsustainable. It's inequitable because people that need access to these things don't have access. They can't pay. It's unsustainable because the prices keep going up well beyond inflation, and it just has to break. There's a breaking point somewhere. So when we can't access this information, it's called information privilege. We can access it, but others can't. And so we often don't see this until we lose access. When you graduate, you'll see this. This is our most common question from graduates. Why can't I access the journals anymore? Okay. So let's talk about open access. So around early 2000s, there started to be a movement to correct some of these issues and create access. So this was all around the rise of the internet, which makes this possible, an unprecedented public good, which is the old tradition of scholars and scientists making their research public without payment for the sake of inquiry and knowledge. I love this. Is so aspiring language, inspiring. The new technology is the internet, and they have this public good of the journal literature that they can make freely available, unrestricted, to anybody, not just scientists and scholars, students, and the curious mind, anybody who's interested. So this is from the Budapest Open Access Initiative. This is where the term open access was defined or established, I guess. So this is what open access is. It's removing barriers to this literature, the paywalls. It's removing access barriers that will accelerate research, enrich education, share the learning with the rich and the poor with the rich. So there is still barriers like access to the internet, access to technology to access the internet. But as long as you have that, you should be able to access all of this knowledge is the goal here. So really what makes this possible is the internet. This wasn't possible before. Open access is really about scholarly literature. We're not talking about the popular literature. We're not talking about, popular authors, fiction authors, or journalists, that kind of thing. They need to be paid. We're talking about this unique situation of scholars that already have a faculty appointment in most cases. So online is what makes this possible, free of charge to readers. There are some business models that charge authors, so we'll talk about that shortly. Free of most copyright restrictions, ideally. So purists would say there are no copyright restrictions other than attribution to the author. So you can use these works, you can read them and use them, as long as you attribute the author, which is what you would want to do anyway as a reputable, researcher. So there's a nice little book you can access here. It's an open access book about open access. It's by one of our leading proponents of this, Peter Suber, who's philosophy professor, used to be at Harvard. Very accessible, unique, sort of compact little book. Concise is what I was looking for. Lots and lots of benefits of open access. I'm sure you can see some of them already. Making your research openly available, I mean, putting it out there without these paywalls, so readers can just access it and read it without having to pay anything, obviously just adds more exposure to your work. So you want your work to be read, that's why you're writing it. So what this means is that all of those sort of unexpected readers is kind of what we call them. So practitioners, if you're a health science researcher, you want, doctors, nurses, other kinds of practitioners, coaches, if you're a kinesiology researcher, maybe you want coaches out in the field to read your research. Generally, these people are not affiliated with universities and they can't access these articles unless they just pay out of pocket, and that gets really expensive really quickly. So practitioners in the field, and this could extend to government workers creating policy. So if you want to influence government policies, they generally can't access the peer-reviewed literature that's behind paywalls. The public. So again, if you're thinking about health sciences, what if you've been diagnosed with some serious illness and you want to read the literature? I mean, it's technical, but if you're motivated, you'll learn, right? So you should be able to read this because you've funded this research in most cases. This is your public taxpayer dollars that have funded the research. Ethically, you should be able to read it. So that's the other one, taxpayer get value. Researchers in developing countries. I mean, this is back to the inequity bit. I mean, researchers there do not have access. We have the privilege in our countries to have all of these access to literature at our universities, well-funded universities. They just don't have that. And nowadays, all these funding agencies are beginning to require that their fundees make their research openly available. And you can imagine like this rise in open access, all more people that are able to access this research, it's getting cited more. So that's the higher citation rates, and this has been shown. So that means your reputation as a researcher is growing because of this. So, so this, again, just more things you can follow up on later. This is a nice article that is very comprehensive in all of the different positive impacts of open access on the literature. Economic, academic, societal, everything. So really making the research publicly available to everybody has the potential to accelerate that research and knowledge creation. Again, it's like those early scientists, it's that knowledge base. If everybody has access to that knowledge base, they can build upon it more easily, more efficiently. They're not recreating things that they haven't been able to read because of paywalls, and they can build upon it. They can also put it into practice like those practitioners. So your research is not just sitting in a journal, not being put to good use if it's a very practical topic. Practitioners can put it into use, can develop policies on it, that kind of thing. So open access democratizes the research results, more people can have access, which again has the potential to increase equity and diversity and inclusion in the research, including more people in the research enterprise. So again, a quote I really like from this last year. You know, the pandemic really illustrates this so well in that if all of the research on COVID-19 was behind paywalls, we would not have progressed so quickly in creating vaccines. It was the virus was sequenced and released openly, and so companies were able to get right on producing therapies and vaccines quickly because the sequence was openly released. Open access is growing. So again, another thing you can follow up on if you're interested. It's growing really quickly. It is the future. Again, we won't get into all the details. There's lots of different flavors of open access, but you can see all the different colors in these charts are different types of open access, and the gray is the closed access. So you can see the projection is that more than 60%, growing to around 70% by 2025 is going to be open access of the journal literature. That's the projection. And of course, you know, not just publications. There's all these sorts of underlying research outputs that you may want to make openly available. And I will plug Kevin's session in a couple days. So he's a colleague of mine at University Library, and he's very interested and knowledgeable about this topic. He'll tell you a whole lot more about this. So making all of these other products of your research openly available too can really increase the efficiency and output of research in general, right? So he'll talk a lot more about that. So let's talk about the practical stuff in our final minutes together here. There really is two routes to open access, okay? So you'll hear these terms, it's a bit of jargon, but because you're going to hear them, I want you to know what they mean. So the gold really means what most people think open access is. You're publishing in an open access journal, right? The journal itself is open access. So that's one route to open access. There's another kind of version of these gold journals, which is called a hybrid journal. So this is a conventional, otherwise paywalled journal that offers authors the option to make their individual article openly available. There's usually a very high cost to this. I mean, these are offered by commercial publishers. Again, they're making, I gotta hand it to them. I mean, they're making a lot of profit. They're finding ways to make profit in this new system too. So green is the other way. So you can publish in that conventional paywall journal, and you can self-archive a copy in an open online repository, and this is free. So a lot of researchers will say, I need to publish in that prestigious journal because I need it for promotion or tenure or whatever, but I can't pay the fees for a hybrid open access. They can still publish in that journal if that's the journal that they need to publish in, okay? They can archive a copy in a repository, and that's free. So let me talk a little bit more about gold. There are some pluses. So this means the very final version of the article is fully open access at the time of publication on the journal's website. So this is where most readers will go to see the article, right? They don't want to encounter a paywall. So that's really a plus. The minuses is sometimes and often, depending on the discipline, there's a processing charge for the author. So I've personally never paid a processing charge for making my articles open access, because in my discipline it's not very common, and I avoid them because I don't think they're ethical. We can talk about that more after, maybe. APCs can be very, very high in hybrid journals, like I mentioned, because these, again, are commercial publishers that are starting to co-opt this system to make an additional revenue stream for themselves. These fees can then exclude many authors without funds. So we're creating new inequities in the system by allowing the commercial publishers to start taking over this, what should have been a good thing. So let me talk quickly about USurge, undergraduate research journal produced here at the University of Saskatchewan. You will have a sure session later on in July about this journal. This is a gold open access journal with no fees for authors, and it's also run by undergraduates here at the university. Okay, so this is a great option for you if you have an article that you're looking to publish. Okay, they will tell you more about that on July 20th. So let's talk a little bit more about green. So like I said, this is self-archiving. The author can post a copy of the article in an online repository, which is free for authors. The minuses, as you can imagine, journals have policies about this. So you publish that article in a closed journal, they have a policy. Often it involves embargo periods, like that you can't make it openly available before 6 or 12 months after publication, that kind of thing. The version, you can only post a post-print version. So that's generally this is the version, which is the final version after the peer review, after revisions. So it looks like a Word document, but it is all the content of the final version, just not the typesetting or the pagination of the journal, the branding and all of that. Generally, they say you can't post in commercial repositories either, something like ResearchGate. Technically not allowed. So the other minus, of course, is it's a bit of extra work for authors, and at that point, they're done with this topic and they're on to another research project, and it's hard to follow through on that one last thing, posting the repository. Sometimes it can be a bit harder for the readers to find too if they're used to going to the journal website. You can find these through Google Scholar. I mean, they're quite easy to find if you're searching that way, but If you're used to going directly to a journal website, then you might have a harder time. Anyway, I won't spend too long on this because this is getting a bit into the weeds, but this is sort of a breakdown of the different article versions that I've mentioned. Okay, I'll let you kind of have a look at that on your own later. We do have an institutional repository for green open access here at the university. It's currently limited to faculty and grad students. So that's simply because of resourcing right now and capacity. Hopefully we can expand that to undergrads at some point. But just so that you're aware, it's there, and this is where the grad student theses and dissertations are as well. But there are other places. These preprint repositories are available. And they are all free to post in, and they're generally subject-based. So you can find one for your subject area, and they're hosted on this open science framework platform, which Kevin, again, will probably talk about in a couple of days. And here are another couple of repository options that you can investigate. So I'll share these slides, like I said. One thing I'll end with is a bit of copyright talk. I know it's not so interesting for a lot of people, but it's very important, okay? So Creative Commons licenses, you've probably seen these symbols before. Don't have enough time to get into all the details, but you can apply these licenses yourself to your work and to give readers an indication of what you are allowing them to do with your work. So when you keep your copyright, you still want to maybe give away some of those rights to your readers, and this is how you can do it. These are free to use. You can follow that link and learn more there. The important thing to remember is that when you create something, whether it's a journal article or whatever you create, you own your copyright to whatever that work is, creative or scholarly or whatever it is, unless or until you sign it away, which is often what the publisher will want you to do. They'll often present you with this copyright transfer agreement, transferring all of those rights, carte blanche, to the publisher. It's not necessary. They don't need all those rights to publish your article. So you can negotiate. I know it's intimidating, and that's why there's these addendums out there that will help you, that will guide you through the process. So anyway, that might be a long way off for many of you, but just so that I plant that seed that your copyright is important to keep. And this is why publishers are able to control so much of the literature, because they control the copyright, all of the rights to the work. Okay, so
there's a question in the chat. If the author retains copyright, can the publisher really control where the authors post their copy?
Depends on what the copyright. There's all sorts of different copyrights, so we'll get into lots of detail here. But I mean, that's one of the things you can negotiate, is where you want to post it afterwards. So if you say, I want to post it on my website, I have a personal website, I want to write that into my contract, a copyright transfer agreement with the publisher. This is somewhere I want to post it. So you can control that right, keep control of that right if that's the right that is important to you. Okay, so we can get into lots of details about that, but there's all sorts of different rights, and you can discuss this with your editor of your journal for sure. And most open access journals will have your copyright is retained with the author, and that you can choose sort of what Creative Commons license you want to apply to it. Yeah, there's lots of, I know there's lots of food for thought here. There's so much information. So I hope I didn't overwhelm you. But there's lots of links to follow, and you can go down your own rabbit hole of what interests you. And please follow up with me and ask any questions. The way I like to end this is, before you even submit to a journal, look at their policies and think about what you value and what you need from that journal before you even submit, because it's much easier then. And then after the peer review process is complete, you just want to have it finished, basically, right? So I have a bunch of further reading if you're interested, and I'm certainly available to answer questions by email. And I have some guides here with lots more information.
Yeah, the university has some amazing research guides on the university website. So if any of you have further questions, you might find the answers there, or certainly to reach out to Dee Dee. Thank you. So I'm going to stop the recording, but if anyone has any further questions, please have them come in. Thanks, Dee Dee, for being with us today.